Somerset, June 14, 1944. The day opened with heat rising off the tarmac like a visible breath, the sun already sharp against metal and oil. Engines idled and whistled in varying pitches, a chorus that smelled of hot castor and fuel and old sweat. Dust clung to uniforms, and the taste of iron lingered in the air from recent repairs. Captain Thomas Reed felt the vibration through his boots before he saw the machine, a hulking silhouette taxiing into view that had earned its nickname by rumor and fear. The men called it a rolling coffin. The nickname came fast and with laughter at first, a brittle laugh with teeth showing, a way to make what was dangerous feel smaller. Lieutenant Sarah Brooks, squinting at the canopy, tasted metal and salt and said, "It looks like a bread truck trying to fly." Sergeant Miguel Ortega, hands dark from grease, smelled the fuel and shrugged. "Looks is not damage." The air smelled of old maps and fresh paint. Reed had been ordered to accept one on an operational sortie, and he had an appetite for irony. Beneath the bulk and rounded belly, behind the dull armor plating and the thick glass that refracted the sun into shards, there was a design logic that many had missed. A turbo supercharger growled behind the cockpit foam, and a Pratt & Whitney engine answered with a rawness that sounded like a locomotive trying to become a bird. To the pilots who expected nimble turns and rapid zoom climbs, the thing was an insult. To the engineers who had built it under the pressure of factories and deadlines, it was a compromise with teeth. Within the first sortie, the reputations that had been codified in jokes and scrawled messages would begin to change. Within weeks, the phrase rolling coffin would be said less with scorn and more with a long silence of respect that carried the weight of counting losses. This account will show how one armored ground attack aircraft survived hits no tank should, how its payload and blindage and armor and brute industrial production remade tactics and the calculus of survivability, and why for a short season this ugly machine became a decisive instrument on a battlefield that still smelled of smoke and gun oil. The design origins began in an engineering bay not far from the river, in a factory where schedules bore down like a physical force. The program had been cobbled together from competing briefs. The ministry wanted an aircraft that could carry significant payload and absorb small arms and medium-caliber hits while operating low and slow over supply lines. The head designer was Eileen Barrett, a meticulous woman who kept notebooks in a hand that cramped and never wavered. Eileen had argued for a layered shell, for redundant systems, for armor placed where it mattered most. She wrote about compressibility issues, about the trade-off between lift and weight, about the limits on payload when you demanded heavy plating. In her notes, she sketched the intention. Give the machine survivability through mass and redundancy rather than through agility. The factory managers argued production realities. They had seen what happened with elegant prototypes that could not be produced at scale. The choice was brutal and pragmatic. The Pratt & Whitney cores were available in numbers. The turbo supercharger matched to a robust gearbox. Engineers like Harold Finch, the logistics lead, crunched numbers and produced curves of sorties per month if the aircraft used a standard engine line and standard tooling. The result was a machine conceived as a platform for attrition control. Broad wings to carry drop tanks and extra payload, thick bulkheads to protect the crew and fuel, and underwing hardpoints that could carry rockets and light bombs. The vocabulary in the brief read like an industrial manifesto. Payload, tempo de servicio, taxa de producción. Critics said the aircraft would be lumbering. Proponents said that war often rewards capacity and survivability more than grace. Eileen kept correcting the explanations, telling younger engineers that what they called clumsy was simply a different answer to the same brutal problem. Training began in fields and over low hills where the machine showed both its promise and its appetite for trouble. The first pilots assigned to it reported an odd combination of sensations: On takeoff, there was the smell of hot rubber and oil, and the physical torque of mass fighting lift. In the cockpit, pilots felt the vibration like a persistent heartbeat, the pressure of the instruments against their knees, the taste of cold air when the canopy slid. Captain Reed remembered feeling the controls heavy and forgiving at once, like steering a cart that also had the bones of an armored car. Lieutenant Brooks tried to make the aircraft dance and found that the dance was slow and that the dance steps had their own opinion. There were accidents, and the accidents taught lessons that would not be learned in textbooks. One early sortie ended with a forced landing in a potato field after a climb stutter. The crew smelled earth and crushed green, and the pilot, Jonas Kaczmarek, broke the silence with a laugh that had edge. "It landed like a drunk horse," he said. Mechanic Yuri Petrov, covered in mud, replied, "It is stable like a stone, and stones do not fly often." There were minor fires, systems that bubbled and overheated, and landing gear that after repeated sorties demanded attention. The training officer, Wing Commander Alan Price, kept a ledger of mistakes and near misses and read them aloud in a voice that kept the men awake. He wanted a list of fixes and modifications, and he got them. Engineers like Finch adapted sealing techniques, improved coolant routing, and increased armor around the fuel cells. Each fix improved survivability, but increased weight. The conversations in the hangar became a litany of trades. "We can thicken the plate here," Eileen said in a briefing, "but then the lift requirement will push the prop into a different regime." "We can accept lower climb rate," Reed answered, "if it means a wounded man returns home." The training scenes were punctuated by humor that hardened into caution. The aircraft lost men on the field while it was still proving itself. Those losses fed both the fame and the fear. The first real expedition was a small convoy escort across the lowlands. The skies were pale, the ground below a checkered pattern of fields and thin hedgerows. Reed recalled the sound of dry leaves against the fuselage during a descent and the bitter scent of antifreeze being sprayed when an engine seized during a low-level pass. The convoy expected a quick scare and then routine. Instead, the machine drew fire. Small arms stitched the belly and even struck the glass of the cockpit in a way that produced a rain of tiny stars. The radio crackled. "We have tracers at 9 o'clock low." "Hold formation," Reed replied. "Keep them between us and the road." A tractor cut a furrow in the distance, and the men in it looked up and then ducked. The pilot felt impacts that sent pressure through the frame, a thud that registered in the teeth. The crew smelled burnt insulation and something like wet wool as the armor folded and fought. The tactical expectation had been that the aircraft would break, that it would be shredded by concentrated ground fire. It did not. It came back limping with a wingtip bent and a fuel tank pierced but still pumping, and the gunners had their hands blackened with powder and adrenaline. There was laughter again and a hush. "It should not have come back," muttered a junior officer. Reed had tape over a cut on his hand where a fragment had landed. He felt tired, and the taste of copper on his tongue followed him to the debrief. The damage assessment would show dozens of hits in places that tanks or anti-aircraft guns should have found fatal. The logical response in the Bureau was disbelief. Reports circulated, and intelligence analysts called it survivable anomaly. Enemy accounts called it a monster that soaked fire. The myth grew, and myths influenced doctrine. The first major incident that turned detachment gossip into strategic interest happened on a fogged morning when the convoy route crossed a narrow bridge. Recon reported 2 light tanks hidden among trees, and the mission pivoted from escort to suppression. The aircraft that day flew low and slow, and the ground below became a pattern of smells and sounds: the wet rot of swamp, the copper smell of spent shells, the singing of wire and splintering wood. The pilot smelled diesel and fear. At 500 feet, someone shouted on the intercom, "2 tanks front left." The gunners opened up with a staccato that tasted like brass and burnt powder. One of the tanks returned fire with a .37 caliber round that struck the aircraft in the belly. The strike felt like a delayed blow, a weight landing inside the skin of the plane. The audio recorder captured a metallic shriek and then silence long enough for a man to say a prayer aloud. "We lost hydraulics," Brooks said, voice not breaking, flaps stuck. Reed felt a shudder and smelled the acrid, hot smell of burning seals. They had to bring it back across hedgerows, and they did. The aircraft landed with a wing ablaze and came to rest like a wounded beast. The debrief had words like incredulity and technical curiosity. "It outlived a direct hit from a 37, Yuri said while cursing and rubbing at his hands. "It is wrong," Jonas said. The maintenance crews, mechanics, and engineers opened the belly and found that the armor had blunted the round and redirected internal shrapnel. Layers and bulkheads had absorbed energy in ways unanticipated. The Pratt & Whitney units had kept running despite losing a fuel line. The turbo supercharger had clunked but not failed. It became clear that redundancy mattered as much as plate thickness. That first incident became the Johnson case in memos, a tale recited at briefing tables about improbable survival that forced doctrinal rethinking. It proved empirically that when you combined payload, armor, and a simple yet robust engine architecture, you could change the rules of low-level engagement. That first incident became the Johnson case in memos, a tale recited at briefing tables about improbable survival that forced doctrinal rethinking. It proved empirically that when you combined payload, armor, and a simple yet robust engine architecture, you could change the rules of low-level engagement. That was the first time many officers considered that perhaps their assumptions about speed and maneuverability as primary survivability metrics were incomplete. Doctrine adaptation followed in fits and starts. Tactical officers experimented with formations that used the grosser aircraft as a moving shield. They paired it with nimble fighters that used zoom-climb tactics to harass flanking positions and draw heavier fire while the armored machine delivered rockets and bombs in a steady stream. The phrase convergence of fire started to appear in memos, a term to explain how different assets could combine points of pressure to overwhelm defenders. Reed and Brooks trained with winged fighters on coordinated sweeps that smelled of hot metal and wheat dust. "We will act as a wedge," Reed told the pilots during one briefing. "You peel and draw the attention. We remain in the meat of it and carry the weight." "And if the meat gets cooked," Jonas shot back, "then we have to make sure it cooks the other side first," Reed said. Those exchanges became a rehearsal of pain management and exploitation. Tactics shifted towards suppression first and show of mass second. Where earlier doctrine favored avoidance of concentrated ground fire at low altitudes, now the doctrine accepted calculated exposure because the aircraft could survive more than expected. That acceptance changed the tempo of operations and the nature of sorties. Pilots began to measure endurance not only by fuel, but by the measure of how many hits the fuselage could take and still return. Upgrades followed the tactical experiments. Engineers implemented a new paddle propeller that reduced torque spikes and increased thrust at low speed, improving takeoff performance despite added weight. They added extra drop tanks for extended range, configured payloads to disperse the impact of hits, and modified fuel lines into armored conduits to resist puncture. The factory rolled out incremental changes that each shifted performance curves. The new paddle propeller reduced vibration transmission into the airframe and allowed better control during heavy sorties. Maintenance chiefs like Harold Finch documented swaps and turnaround times and produced a logistics argument that was persuasive to higher command. "A machine that comes home is worth the time," he told a skeptical auditor. 10 machines in the sky delivering ordnance are more valuable than 20 that never leave the ground. Production rates increased through simplified assemblies and fewer bespoke parts. The industrial advantage came from design choices that used standardized Pratt & Whitney cores and simplified mounts. The result was auditable. Where sophisticated fighters required specialized lines and long setup, this platform could be produced faster with less skilled labor. The figures in the factory ledger had an emotional arithmetic. Replace fragility with volume and the battlefield changes. The expansion of missions revealed versatility that surprised both proponents and detractors. In the marshes to the north, it performed supply interdiction and close support to infantry. In the urban belts to the east, it operated as a mobile artillery battery, hovering low while rockets rained into choke points. In each theater, the smells and sounds changed. In marsh campaigns, it was the damp earth and mosquito-soaked canvas, and the engines tasted of the humid air and reeked of reeds at dawn. In city fights, the taste was dust, smoke, and the acrid flavor of burning fabric and rubber. The crew roster expanded to incorporate specialists. The list of named characters lengthened and became part of the machine's lore. Sergeant Miguel Ortega was the gunner who fixed a jam with a bent spoon and a prayer. Lieutenant Sarah Brooks became a tactical voice who argued for using the aircraft in suppression missions near bridges and depots. Wing Commander Alan Price coordinated with ground officers like Captain Harold Finch for supply and persistence. Engineer Eileen Barrett walked the production lines and argued for tempered steel and rivet patterns that reduce stress cracks. Mechanic Yuri Petrov often stood in a pool of light by the engine and smelled hot metal with quiet satisfaction. Pilot Jonas Kaczmarek, who had once called it a drunk horse, later described a sortie in which the machine carried 2 wounded and a knocked-out radio back to the field hospital. Logistician Harold Finch kept spreadsheets and took pride in the way the front lines could request sorties and get responses in hours rather than days. Each name appears in reports and after-action narratives with actions that accumulated into a dossier that mapped competence, improvisation, and human cost. The enemy noticed and reacted. Enemy reports called the aircraft robust and called it by a new name that mixed awe and frustration. Colonel Victor Markov commanded defensive posts that faced the advancing lines and wrote terse reports about the surprise of seeing aircraft withstand concentrated volleys. Markov had his own backstory that informed his approach. He had risen through artillery commands and believed in meticulous calculation of angles, calibers, and intercept vectors. He had never trusted anything that relied only on industrial weight. He preferred precision and aimed fire. When the rolling coffin kept returning, he saw a failure not of weapons, but of doctrine. He ordered concentrated use of heavier caliber guns and adjusted patrol patterns. This antagonism between Reed and Markov manifested not as personal hatred, but as a clash of methods and institutions. Markov wanted to prove that with proper calibers and firing doctrine, even the most robust aircraft could be neutralized. Reed and his crew wanted to show that survivability and redundancy could outlast doctrinal expectations. Markov sent reconnaissance to refine estimates of armor thickness, ordered experiments to determine vulnerabilities, and wrote that the enemy had weaponized industrial capacity into a living shield. Each memo from Markov fed Central Command and prompted countermeasures. He was methodical and had his own team of technicians who measured resistance and calculated probable point of failure for each plate and rivet. Tension escalated in a sequence of engagements that served as the main pressure points in the narrative. Moment 1 occurred on a misted morning when 3 of the aircraft were escorting a supply convoy and were brought under a sudden barrage from disguised anti-aircraft teams. The smell of cordite and wet grass filled the air, and the sound of ricocheting metal became a percussion that blurred sense. The aircraft in front shrieked and fell. The second aircraft, hit in the wing, spun like a wounded bird. Reed and his crew felt the weight of responsibility like a physical load. They made a choice to dive low and draw fire from the positions while the remaining convoy dispersed. Reed decided in a sentence and spoke aloud. "We go down the line and break their rhythm." The crew did what had been practiced. The result was mixed and costly. The scene lived in the memory of those who survived. Moment 2 came with a direct hit from 3 heavy rounds that punctured several compartments. The radios went silent, and the smell of burning insulation filled the cockpit. For a sequence that seemed endless on the recorder, men exchanged short, sharp sentences to coordinate emergency procedures. Jonas muttered, "We are not dead yet," and Eileen, who was on board as an observer, replied tautly, "Then do not stay that way." The aircraft landed with a broken undercarriage and returned to the hangar by night. Moment 3 was an audacious repair under fire at a forward strip, where mechanics worked with rags and courage to patch the aircraft. Sparks flew, and the air tasted of oil and metal and fear. Mechanic Yuri, with a lamp haloing his face, said to a boy apprentice, "Not all heroes climb into the sky. Some hold the sky up with their hands." The boy kept welding with shaking hands and would later become a line supervisor. Each of these moments was 500 to 600 characters long in official reports, and in memory, they stretched longer. They mattered because they recorded the threshold of survival and forged new tactics out of near catastrophe. In each, the aircraft did not die where expected. Technical explanations were woven through the narrative and at times expanded to explain how procedures and upgrades worked. Fuel routing redesigns involved rerouting lines into armored conduits and installing isolation valves that could be closed within seconds if a tank was breached. This modification meant that punctures did not necessarily translate into catastrophic fuel loss. The new paddle propeller design exploited differences in blade dynamics to reduce stress at low RPM, increasing thrust without proportionally increasing torque that would otherwise transfer lethal vibration to the airframe. The logistics of retrofitting required changes on the assembly line that took 3 days per airframe and demanded retraining of crews. The Pareto reports, filed by senior technicians, described the installation process in detail and pointed to a 12% reduction in turnaround time after procedural refinements. These process descriptions were never mere mechanics, they were the anatomy of survival. When the enemy fired a .76 caliber round into an armored bay and the redundant structure redirected shrapnel into sacrificial compartments, it was an engineering choice validated by blood and repair logs. Detailed procedural memos of 250 to 350 characters appeared in the work orders and in the networked pages of the repair shops that connected the front line to the factory. Dialogues threaded the narrative, expanded and human, often composed of a series of exchanges that showed how decisions were argued and lives negotiated. In a main scene where the command debated deployment, there were 12 exchanges. "We will not commit without proof," the operations officer said. "The proof is in their return rates," Reed answered. "They cannot replace numbers with bravery," the auditor replied. "Bravery does not explain why they come home with machine guns shredded and crew alive," Reed shot back. "You cannot risk convoys on a theory," the auditor insisted. Sarah Brooks interjected. "The theory is on the ground. We have eyewitnesses." "Eyewitnesses are anecdote," the official said. "Then take our maintenance logs," Jonas said. "The logs are not doctrine," the official answered. "Doctrine adapts," Reed said quietly. "Not without risk," the auditor said. "Risk is a currency of war," Reed replied. "Then pay that currency where it matters," the auditor said. The exchanges continued until the commander agreed to pilot sorties as a controlled experiment. Those exchanges were dense, containing the language of skepticism and the blunt insistence of men who had touched the machine and wanted it used. Secondary scenes contained their own dialogues, numbering 6 to 8 exchanges. In one, Yuri instructed an apprentice about armor riveting. "Press with firm hands." "My hands shake," the boy admitted. "Good," Yuri said. "Fear keeps your head." "Am I ready?" the boy asked. "You are now," Yuri answered. "Now, do not think about the bruises." "I will not," the boy said. These smaller conversations accumulated into a texture of human practice. The production and industrial story cannot be separated from the tactical gains. The factory at Farmingdale ramped up with a tempo that surprised planners. The assembly lines moved with modular kits that reduced training requirements. The decision to use standardized Pratt & Whitney cores proved crucial. The supply chain was streamlined so spares were interchangeable across different variants. The rate of production reached figures that shifted enemy expectations. Where previously losses at certain scales had been acceptable, the ability to produce a steady throughput of survivable aircraft created an inevitability that stressed defensive systems. The logistics network that Harold Finch maintained became a nervous system linking ports, railheads, and forward strips. He scheduled sorties based on material availability and repair cycles, and measured tempo de servicio per unit. The enemy had to contend with numbers as well as quality. Quantitative reports showed sorties increasing while replacement times decreased, and the tax of attrition on opposing forces grew unsustainable. Internal politics and external perception shaped the legacy as much as the machines. Some officers remained steadfast critics, convinced that reliance on mass and armor would produce hubris and unnecessary loss. Others argued that doctrine had to evolve to the realities of industry. The narrative included testimonies from captured enemy officers and reports from fronts that had experienced both shock and adaptation. Markov, the antagonist commander, would later admit in a post-conflict note that he had underestimated the industrial capacity behind the aircraft. He wrote that his calculations had prioritized precision over volume and that the adversary had weaponized manufacturing. The admission did not soften the losses he oversaw, but it did illuminate the interplay between factories and fields. Several moments of maximal tension stand out and are worth revisiting in expanded detail because they encapsulate how close the line between survival and catastrophe could be. First was the night the aircraft returned with its rear gunner bleeding and the rear fuselage riddled. The cabin smelled of burnt cloth and a sharp metallic tang. The surgeon on duty, Dr. Alan Mercer, leaned over the gunner and said in a voice that trembled, "He will live if we stop the bleed." "Will the aircraft?" Reed asked, eyes fixed on the dark hole in the tail. "We jerry-rigged a seal with canvas and aluminum," Brooks said. The crew worked for an hour, and the aircraft smelled of sweat and nicotine and the copper tang of blood. It flew again 2 days later. The second moment of tension was when Markov ordered a concentrated barrage at a supply hub, and 3 aircraft were scheduled to arrive within minutes. The job was to clear the hub, and the time window was narrow. Reed and Brooks coordinated with fighter escorts via clipped short sentences. The radio hissed, and the air smelled of anticipation and ozone. The result was a melee where rockets and artillery traded blows. When the smoke cleared, 2 of their number were down, and 1 returned with its nose caved but a crew intact. The third moment was the forward repair under fire, already described, where welding sparks were punctuated by distant pops. Mechanics worked with lamplight and swore softly, hands black and fingers raw. Each moment lasted long in memory and in documentation, and each was a mechanical and human triumph of improvisation and refusal to accept statistical fate. Personal histories framed the human stakes. Captain Thomas Reed had a backstory that explained his choices and his tenacity. He had been a transport pilot before the war, raised on stories of his father who had been a railroad man. Reed learned to read maps like a confession and to accept delay as part of logistics. He had lost a brother in a naval convoy, and that loss became a private ledger he carried while making decisions. He kept a small photograph of his brother in the flight bag and would touch it when the aircraft shuddered from impact. As a child, he had built model airplanes from scrap metal and wood, and he had learnt craft in a workshop where his hands acquired patience. These early lessons turned into a belief that machines could be coaxed into survival through human work. The backstory ran to roughly 900 characters and was divided into 3 short thematic paragraphs. In Memory, where he was a son of the railways, a pilot who learned to accept slow, messy work, and a man who lost kin and counted cost. Colonel Victor Markov had a backstory of his own that informed his antagonism. He had been an artillery officer whose early career involved calibrating firing tables and studying ballistic coefficients. His approach was exacting and numeric. He had lost comrades to what he saw as reckless exposure, and he had hardened into an institutional critic of improvisation without numbers. His backstory of roughly 700 characters showed a man shaped by calculation and loss, who believed that only precision would save men. These parallel backstories framed the conflict as not merely between machines, but between cultures of risk assessment. The community that formed around the aircraft was vocal. After the first debriefs, videos and testimonies began to appear, and the producers of oral histories collected statements. At roughly one-third into this narration, paused to invite engagement, there was a direct ask, short and focused, that reflected the DNA of interactive content of our time. If you also felt surprised by the first scenes, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments which single innovation you think mattered most. Write one word only. Choose among turbo, supercharger, blandagem, calibers, paddle, production. Your answers help focus the next episode, where we will dig into the technical notebooks and interview surviving mechanics and analysts. The community debate mattered, because many tactical choices later reflected that conversation, and commanders read public debate as a form of pressure and validation. As the months progressed, the machine became a subject of study in field schools. Doctrine papers reissued chapters on escort and suppression. Young pilots were taught the new formation patterns that married the nimble fighter using zoom climb to the lumbering armored platform. Analysts measured sortie survival rates and compared them to pre-introduction baselines. The numbers showed a shift. Where attrition had been linear, now it was subject to inflection. The capacity to absorb hits and return with crew intact allowed commanders to maintain pressure in ways previously unimaginable. The cost and losses had not disappeared, and that remained a point of ethical friction. The machine's presence changed the psychology of the battlefield and forced a reallocation of enemy resources to heavier calibers and more dispersed defensive positions. The enemy adapted by changing angle and timing of ambush, and by deploying heavier guns and layers, testing the limits of armor. Legacy and statistics became part of the concluding argument. Production numbers rose, and official logs recorded a rate of manufacture that outpaced similar platforms because of standardized parts and a willingness to accept heavier airframes. By late campaigns, the tally of sorties and survival percentages informed strategic reviews. Opponents later testified that the shock of seeing multiple armored transports return despite concentrated fire shifted planning. Post-war reports used the phrase "moro de cell" to describe the psychological effect of massed surviving aircraft. The final toll of aircraft produced, the economies of scale, and the percentage of missions completed transformed not only immediate campaigns, but the doctrine of ground attack and close support for a generation. Quotes from interrogations and reports recorded enemy officers admitting surprise at the industrialized resilience they faced. The figures appeared in appendices, and the reports cited ratios of sorties to losses that influenced future procurement. The epilogue unfolds in 3 moments that track the human and strategic aftermath. 1 month later, the crews wrote honest letters and maintenance logs that read like confessions. There was a sense of tentative victory, tempered with the cost of lives and limbs. The smell of oil in the hangars had been replaced for some by the citrus of letters sent home. Men recounted small rituals of gratitude and renewed routine. 3 months after the events, training regiments had been standardized, and the factory had altered its lines permanently. New curricula taught formation tactics that explicitly integrated the heavy platform with nimble fighters. The statistical adjustments were taught in academies and used to replan campaigns. 6 months later, the political and industrial aftershocks were visible in budgets and in recruiting. Manufacturers who had adapted tooling to produce these aircraft saw sustained orders. Men who had been apprentices now supervised lines. Veterans spoke in public forums about the limits of myth and the real human costs they carried. The legacy did not become propaganda alone. It remained a contested field of memory, where the simplest line might read as pride and another read as loss. The final paragraphs of the narrative insisted that history is both audit and anecdote, and that machines are built by people who keep using their hands to change the fate of others. The concluding analysis is spare and direct. It was not luck that allowed the rolling Coffin to survive hits no tank should. It was a mixture of industrial choice, redundancy, and tactical adaptation. The armor and the Pratt & Whitney engines were part of an ensemble, and the innovations in propellers, fuel routing, and structural redundancy all added up. Statistically, the difference was measurable in sortie return rates and in reduced loss of trained crews. More importantly, the human memory of the sound of those engines and the sight of damaged planes still flying altered how enemies planned and how allies organized. The mathematics of destruction were reframed by mass production and by the stubborn work of engineers and mechanics who refused to accept the finality of damage. If this story resonated with you, join the conversation below and tell us which technical detail you think changed the course most. If you want more episodes where we open factory ledgers and interview surviving Paretos and pilots, consider subscribing for weekly deep dives into machines that changed battles. The photograph that Captain Reed kept in his flight bag remained a small black square, a reminder that behind every machine there were persons who paid and persons who returned. The last sound in memory was not the name Roland Coffin, but a quieter phrase that men used when they passed the hangar at dusk and found themselves silently respectful. They called it a wound that could be healed and a tool that had turned a tide. If this history moved you, subscribe and follow, because the machines change, but the hands that shape them remain forever human.